Welcome to Expression, a discussion of religious freedom in America, presented by the Moody Media Lab. I'm tonight's host, Matt Till, lead pastor of Restoration Church in the Chicago suburbs and communications professor here at Moody Bible Institute. I'm joined by some amazing students here from Moody, Sam Choi, Andrew Williams, and Paul Savage. Guys, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
No problem.
It's my pleasure.
All right. Well, listen, I want to first give a shout out to the video Practicum team here at Moody. This is a student-led, student-inspired, and student-produced production. It was on their hearts to address a difficult and often controversial topic in the church and produce a helpful resource for the church. We hope this will be both an insightful and challenging discussion with some of our future leaders. You guys ready for tonight's discussion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's do it. I love it. Well, obviously, we're talking about religious freedom and freedom of religion, but really this is a First Amendment right issue, right? And it's kind of a bit unique to America because this is a bit of a right that we have written into our U.S. Constitution. And actually, I just want to kind of remind us of what it says. So the First Amendment states, the first words out of it are, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So how do you guys understand the various interpretations of this amendment? Sam, I want to just start with you.
Sure. The First Amendment, I think, protects the rights of the people to express their thoughts and beliefs on whatever subject, to be honest, because it ranges everywhere from just speech to religion to the press and to even petition the government of any grievances. So it allows the people to have direct access to vocally or just verbally make their claims to anyone. And I think that's what it was meant to be.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that, especially when it comes to the freedom of speech, that it is definitely meant to protect people and protect discourse, the act of discourse in and of itself. That what makes really a part of our society so great is the fact that we can come together and have equal discourse with one another and have conversations about different beliefs and different backgrounds and things like that, to where people can actually come together as equals rather than higher or lower.
Right, right. Paul, how do you understand the First Amendment as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with what they've just said. I think it's important to look at the historical context a little bit. Most of the founders of the country were, most of the people there came from a background of English oppression with religion because the state was so closely tied with the church. And so if you deviate from what the favored religious party is, or even political party, then you're not going to be doing very well in England. So I think that the founders put that in there for the purpose of allowing people to express themselves, express their ideas without that sort of restrictions, without the government favoring one side or another.
Yeah, so what do you think? I think there's, we're all kind of, it seems like you guys are all kind of on the same page here by saying, like, listen, this is a mandate for liberty, right? It's a mandate to say, like, there's liberty within our government to have an expression of religion. But some are saying, actually, it's more designed to put limits on the church, right? And to limit involvement within the government and society. What would you guys say in response to that? Do you feel like there's any merit to that? Sam?
You know, I kind of just thinking back on what Paul was saying, I would say that that expression gives you, the minority group or minority opinion, space to talk without fear of a major repercussion from the government or the ruling party, or that may be. So with that, there might be some cases where it seems there should be some limits on the church, but in reality is that the church itself doesn't swallow up other expressions against their will. And at the same time, the minority should not have the power to overtake a larger group.
Yeah. Paul, what were you going to say?
Oh, I agree. I think that the limitations it puts in place, I think, are appropriate because if you look throughout Christian history, whenever there's some of the most horrible things that have happened by the church is usually when the church and the state are so closely tied together that the people who are so politically driven by greed and by power and all these things are also the people who are running clergies and different things like that. So if you, draw that separation, then all of a sudden you have people who want to be godly servants of the church and things like that. They're not going into the same place as people who want to be servants of the government and things like that. And so I think it's a healthy limitation.
Yeah, yeah. So, it seems like if we're watching the news, right, And it would seem as if, it appears that Christians seem to only be vocal in matters of politics, right? We seem to be abortion, and have all this concern about the LGBTQ community, right? But yet the church would seemingly be silent on issues of gun control, right? Or even racism, or even the ongoing refugee crisis. What would you say to that? And actually, is this really a universal, accurate depiction of Christianity when it comes to First Amendment rights and the issues that are at play here and at stake?
I think what the American church, I think this is, because this is, I think, a uniquely Western church, a Western world church problem. But I think when it comes to this, what the Western church struggles with is we can easily see the sin in the world, and we can easily get behind, we can all come together no matter what creed or what maybe carpet you put in the, you agree upon in the foyer or whatever it may be, and what divides churches, that kind of melts away when we all see the sin in society and we can see where society may be going. But when it comes to issues then of rights and freedoms, we don't like to infringe upon that. So things like gun control, things like race issues, things like the LGBT, we can see the sin and we're all behind stopping the sin. But when it comes to the need and to the rights that may infringe upon ours as well, that's when the waters are starting to get murky. I think you're starting to see the Western church really struggle with that. The American church really struggling and wrestling with what's more important, our rights or our beliefs.
It seems to breed a bit of hypocrisy, doesn't it, within the church at times? And I think I can understand when the world and the society seems to suggest that the church is hypocritical in these matters, but I don't necessarily believe that that's the case. But I do think, though, that perhaps our voice has been really strong in some areas and weak in others, right? And I think seems to be this movement towards using First Amendment rights to suggest that the church needs to, get with the program, or basically to shut up and sit down, right? But yet in other cases, I feel like we are using the First Amendment right to suggest, no, we need to be more vocal in these areas. What do you guys think? I mean, Paul, do you feel like that these are accurate depictions of the church? You think the church is really hypocritical in how it's handling these issues? And
I don't know. I don't know if I would call it hypocritical. It seems like sometimes on surface level it seems that way, but I don't know. Me and the guys on my floor, we talk about this kind of thing all the time, and we kind of give equal opinions on just about every issue. And sometimes the conclusions that we come up with are different from what the consensus of general society has. And so what might be painted as hypocrisy might just be a failure to understand the other side, in my view. So when it seems like we're really working hard for abortion and the LGBT stuff and all that, but yet ignoring racial inequality and the refugee crisis and stuff, I think Christians, especially our generation, really care about those issues, but a lot of times we come to different conclusions on how to deal with those. And usually the general population, the secular world, looks on under that failure of consensus and sort of paints it as hypocrisy as a general thing.
Just to kind of go off of that and look at it maybe a different perspective. I think a lot of it is a lot of what we start to march against, in the sense of how you hear the church's voice on matters of abortion and LGBT. But these are kind of like our front door matters. They're at our front door. These are the things that we see and that we can easily have a hand in. But when it comes to maybe even race issues or gun violence, things like that, a lot of the church, I don't think that's at their front door. And I think a lot of it is kind of out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's been, and not to say that they are purposely doing it, but and I don't think, like Paul was saying, I don't know if it's like hypocrisy per se, but I think it's more of out of sight, out of mind. And I think what we're starting to see is a church starting to realize there's greater need out there. And I think it's a time for the church to start seeing the nitty gritty, how Christ himself, Christ didn't preach up on top of the mountain alone, but he went into the streets and he went into the cesspools of society and ate with tax collectors and drew a line in front of the sand in front of a woman who was going to be stoned to death for adultery. He went and sat with people, and so he didn't let things become just front door issues. He went out to see see the world, and he ministered to the world, and I think it's time for the church to do the same.
Yeah.
And yes, I think we're starting to see that a little bit.
Yeah, Andrew, I love that perspective actually, because what you're bringing up, I think, is an opportunity for the church, right? And to yes, there's a lot of the distinction between front door and back door, right?
Yeah.
I think is appropriate, at least in the sense of going, yeah, it's right at our front door. We're dealing with this, right? It's here, and perhaps there is something to be learned, because at the end of the day, we have a lot to speak into all the doors, right? And we have a lot, as the church, we have a lot to say and to speak into and to bring life into these areas that are even not the most, it's not in the media every day. It's not the most exciting blockbuster breaking news kind of event, right?
Yeah.
And I think the church we can speak into those moments as well, but at the same time, I think that there's an opportunity for us to speak into those other issues and to even go into and engage with the things that are even not as publicized, which actually the church is doing. We just don't hear about it. It's happening every single day, right? And just kind of turning that back to our discussion on freedom of religion, Sam, what do you think about, like, do we feel like that the church does the church have a PR issue, essentially? Like, do we need to be at the front door? Do we need to be dealing with the front door issues? Do we need to politicize or to proclaim more of the backdoor issues or the things that seem to be not as prevalent in the news? And do we need to be talking about that more in order to state our claim to First Amendment rights, to say that we have a right to make sure that we can practice and express our faith without hindrance?
I think that part of the problem there is that the world has a certain idea of what the church's expression of the First Amendment should look like. And so they're trying to define for us, because no matter where the church is trying to act and bring life to, I believe the world will fight it vehemently, right? Because even the LGBTQ issue is the church trying to say bring life in an area of sexual wholeness, right? And the church is trying to combat it. Maybe not in the best ways, and maybe not using the correct language, but they're trying to do it in ways to bring life to those who are morally lost in their faculties. And people will hate that. People that do not love God will hate that. And we see that with other issues in the past. When people who were not believers still wanted slavery to be a thing, especially in England, it was the Christians who fought against that. And the world at the time fought against that idea. Yeah. They said this is going to overturn the economy and things like that. It's not right. It's my property. It's my whatever it might be. So I think that no matter what the church does, the world will not like the expression that we give. And then the other aspect of that, I think, is the church must continue to do what they're called to do, regardless of what the world is trying to pull them away from. Yeah. And sometimes I think we get sidetracked by some of these issues where they might not be as important, even though the world might think is of dire consequence. Yeah, yeah.
I kind of want some of this conversation tends to lean itself into matters of hate speech, right? Because I think at the end of the day, we start kind of getting into this topic of First Amendment rights. The church has a right to speak up, to speak its mind, has a right to assemble, has a right to, without fear of persecution. And yet, at the other times, there's a sense of going, is there a line that is to be considered that can be crossed? Is there a place where there needs to be limits put on what can be said or would not be said? What do you guys think about this talk of hate speech and the church specifically? Does the church engage in hate speech? Should there be limits on what can be said in the public square, even within the context of our individual churches at all? Paul?
I'd say absolutely not. I think that hate speech is so subjective. If you were to ask the three of us where we would draw the line, all three of us would give you a different answer. If you extend that to society at large, there's so many inconsistencies that just to say that our legislators ought to determine where we draw that line, I think that's very, I would be cautious of that, especially for us in the church, because I've evangelized to people before who have, I say Jesus Christ is the only way of salvation, and red flags go up in their head, and all of a sudden they're almost having a mental breakdown. They don't like that. And so even that could be considered hate speech. So when we start drawing those lines, I think it's very dangerous for us as a church body here in the United States.
Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, I think what's happened is that we've kind of, on both sides, confused what the First Amendment, I think, in just looking at the wording and everything, has really for, and was to protect that discourse, that to allow people to air their grievances, to allow to ask that the government change their law. Like, this is discourse, and I think that we've all become so defensive about our opinions, and everyone assumes that their opinion has to be correct. And I think you see that from the church's perspective, from the church's side, and from the secular side. And I think really what we're seeing in the hate speech is a repercussion of a long time reaction for the churches seeing the changes in the American society. And I think for a long time, I mean, if we're being honest, like, America has been culturally Christian. And you start seeing cultural Christianity leak in with Sunday Christians and people not even being able to tell you what's in the Bible, but they know what to do on Sunday. And I think what happens is you have this cultural Christianity that knows what's wrong, but they don't know what they need to do. And so I think there's been this line drawn in the sand with Christians and the church saying, like, homosexuality's bad, you're staying on that side. Like, prostitution's bad, you stay on that side. Adultery's bad, we'll sometimes not ignore that, you're still over there, kind of. And so we kind of pick and choose. And we've labeled, like, these sins as worse sins. Like, oh, homosexuality's up there, abortion's up there, but like, in God's eyes, all sin is sin. And that there is no this level of playing field, that there is just this line of sin, and it's all equally as, to God, not sin, like evil. And so I think that we've drawn this line, and so now people are reacting to that line. So now the church wants to cross it and say, hey, we're here for you. They're like, no, 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 you drew that line, you get to hold to that line. And so now I think we're trying to break down those walls. But
Yeah, I feel like, actually I want to tell you a little story, because I did a little experiment on Facebook. I mean, all things holy happen on Facebook, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I did this little experiment, and I asked all my friends, what are some of the pain points for you that it causes you to not engage with church, a church, or even religion or faith in general, right? Specifically towards Christianity. And I was curious to hear about what are some of the things that people are saying about the church, or they're sensing or feeling when they engage, right? And I mean, it was across the board, just like all sorts of things. Anything from hypocrisy to I feel judged when I walk into my church, when I walk into church. Poor leadership, pastors who don't, they abandon, the gospel message for a feel-good message. I heard everything, from everywhere from solid Christians to those who are a little lapsed, or those who are seeking, to those who are just completely non-believers. And I was edified by it. I was encouraged by it, just because I was able to, hear just all the different things that cause people to say, like, I don't want to engage with church for these reasons. And one of the things that was coming up was this idea of hypocrisy, this idea of, and this notion of judgmental, and even like this concern, even for like hate speech, right? And although nobody really said and used the phrase hate speech, it was insinuated, right? And I think that it's a lesson, I think, for us as a church to hear and to go, have we replaced the message for love, the message for, that Christ loved his church, and that God's love for mankind, have we replaced that with hate? Have we replaced that with, and I think there's an interesting line we've got to walk, because our calling is to see sin for what it is. But have we leaned more on law than we have on grace? Have we leaned more on do this, for this is exactly what God's rule in law is, and less on the loving nature of what it means to be a witness and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves? Sam, what do you think? What's your impression of that?
I would say we tend to lean to the law, to the to-do list. Even being at Moody Bible Institute, we have the SLG, and there's a lot of things in there that I would say is either outdated or even things that actually don't even add to our righteousness in the sense. So I'm not even talking about outside of the church context. So this is still within the church. There's people who believe, if you're baptized into this denomination, then you're not saved, or if you engage in these kinds of activities, you're not saved. So I would definitely tend to lean that direction, that we might have set a structure in place that was meant for good, but now it's lost the spirit in it.
Yeah.
So, so now we're checking our boxes off and making sure we're going through this structure,
Yeah.
but we're lost the purpose as to why we're doing what we're doing. Because
Yeah.
there was great purpose as to why I'm sure there was great reason why the SLG was written the way it was back whenever it was written, and that it was edifying to the community.
Yeah.
But now it seems that we've lost the principle and we're just enforcing rules.
Yeah. Yeah, Andrew?
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree. I think that we've, just kind of like with the cultural Christianity, we've kind of become, we knew what the checklist was, and so we just kind of held to that. But I think even with this approaching with this more of a new age society, this post-modernity, we're approaching an era where we have to also be a little bit careful because we could sway the way of the Corinthians, and we are free to do whatever we want, and though it may not be edifying. But I think I would agree that a lot of what we're seeing, like this hate speech, is, I think, again, a repercussion of just how we drew the line and how we've drawn a line in the sand. And we weren't eating and walking with people. We weren't sitting at a table with them, but rather separating ourselves from them. And so now when we try to speak into their lives, to them it's hateful because we're coming from an outside perspective. Like, what do you know about me?
Right.
And so I think that it's kind of just a natural reaction.
Yeah.
But it's funny because it's like, what do you know about me? It's like, you can't judge me because you don't, like, you're a Christian, you're perfect. Like, that's not even the case. Like,
Yeah.
the majority of Christians today have the struggles that they deal with. And I mean, I get it too, because we're trying to push a morality that they don't understand, right?
Yeah.
So like, there's a holiness of God requires these things, but they don't get it. So personally for me, like with the whole free speech, I think the church does have the ability to speak out what they want to believe about what the world is doing, but at the end of the day, so what, we're right. They're still going to hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, so.
Yeah, and I feel like what's, the question is now when we start talking about politics, like, because at the end of the day, this is a legislated right that has been given, right? And the government has the ability and the choice to rescind that right or to change that. They could even, they could say something, well, let's clarify this. Let's say Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. What if they say Congress shall make a law that says nobody can establish any sort of religion, period? What if they reword it in such a way that says we're going to actually suppress all the religions, right? Because there's a concern that perhaps Islam is a hateful religion, one that's filled with evil and terrorism, because that's what it's associated with. And Christians are associated with bombing abortion clinics, right? So is that a fair, like, should we be fighting in the public square and in politics to protect this mandate, or to protect this right and liberty for us and for others, or should we just back off of it and pursue other means? Paul, what do you think?
Well, I think we should absolutely be as engaged in this political matter as we can, because this is essential to the United States, right? Christianity can survive just about anything. We have God on our side.
True,
but for the sake of the church in the United States and spreading the gospel still, I think that it's extremely important, because at the end of the day, what speech is the expression of your thoughts. And so when you start restricting that, you're restricting what people are allowed to think. And when you start doing that, that's completely contrary to what the United States was supposed to be. That's completely contrary to the Constitution. We have a whole different system of government at that point, honestly.
Andrew, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I actually would agree that we should be fighting for this. But I think what we need to understand is that we are going to fight for this First Amendment right of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but then that goes for everybody. That the church then, I think sometimes we get our feathers in a ruffle a little bit, because we have Muslims trying to convert us, and we have, we have Jews trying to convert Christians and people like that. And so it's like, we're just having that freedom of religion that's open for everybody. But I think it's super important, because we need to protect that discourse, because, like, going back to Acts 17 with Paul, like when he was at the Areopagus, Paul went and he taught in the synagogue, and he was teaching the Jews, and then he went out into the streets and he talked to philosophers, and he had discourse, and he got to know people, and he got to know what their beliefs were, and like talked to them and got to know them. And then he went to the Areopagus and then to the town square, and then openly preach. Now, I definitely think that we should be openly preaching against sin, against the world, because Satan wants nothing more than for us to stay quiet. But I think that just seeing Paul and how he sat there and he understood people and got to know people, because that way when he went up to the public square, and even if this was one of his least productive sermons that some scholars would claim, he went up to the Areopagus and he said, let me tell you you guys are some really religious people. I respect you for that.
Yep.
He goes, but I saw all these idols laying around, but I saw one that said to the unknown God. Right. Let me tell you about the unknown God. And it's having that, that is an important key, that we protect that First Amendment right so we can have those discourses. Yeah. That if we try, not to say that Christianity can't thrive, like Paul said, anywhere, because I think we've seen that Christianity thrives best under turbulence, but...
Well, and I think what you bring up is an interesting point as we tie in Scripture to modern day, is that mankind is inherently spiritual, right? And we actually deal in spiritual things. And even to the pagan worshipers in right in Greece, here they were worshiping idols, right? And they had this one called to an unknown God. We don't even he's the one that does all the things we don't know that it does, and so we worship him anyway, just in case. In case we missed one out, we don't want to anger the gods, right? There's an inherent spirituality, right, to mankind and to the human race that it feels like that we speak into, and to simply to say that we will not acknowledge any of those things is really contrary to the soul of a human that's ever been born, right? And we see this as being played out, and of course, in countries that suppress faith and religion, such as China, and Christianity is just exploding over there. They can't even control it. It's happening. The underground church is just going like wildfire because they realize their deep need to fulfill the spiritual need, right? Sam, do you think that that we should be considered to be engaged in this in a political matter in the First Amendment?
I actually don't. I think regardless of what the political state is, we should still keep speaking. We should keep proclaiming the gospel. We should keep engaging the public, whether it's at risk of our lives or not. And I honestly, with First Amendment being in place in America, I feel like in some cases it actually made the church comfortable and lazy, because we don't have to be in fear of, if I proclaim this from the rooftop, I might get stoned. And honestly, when Paul was explaining the gospel to the Jews and to different pagan religions, they didn't like it. They stoned him, and that was the cost of it. And I think it's the same today, where in America, we have the luxury of it. And I'm not saying that the First Amendment should go away, but I'm saying let's utilize it now while we have it, because we don't know what will happen to it. Because when it does change, we still got to do it, but it's going to cost us something,
So let me ask you this then. So what advice would you give to a pastor, to a church, to somebody who is been kind of thinking about these front door matters, these front door issues? What advice would you guys give to the church or to a pastor that says, who's dealing with First Amendment issues, or how you would advise them to think even differently about First Amendment rights and issues? I'll start with you, Sam.
It's easy for me to say because I'm not a pastor of a church. I'm not a public figure at all. So
I'm a pastor, and I'm asking you, so tell me.
So I could be you should engage, you should preach out what you feel like the Lord is convicting your heart of. But at the same time, it's hard to do it alone. It's actually kind of astounding how many Christians will become silent and back off when one group is being persecuted. When I was a part of a group that went to Houston to host an event for 5 pastors who were politically engaged in stopping a bathroom bill that would allow transgendered people into any bathroom. And the mayor of the city wanted to subpoena the pastors, their phone calls, their text messages, and their sermons. And they found it as a violation of their First Amendment rights. So they actually fought it in the political arena. But during that time, it helped that she went after 5, because then they came together. And then those congregations came together. But typically, when a community starts coming against a Christian business or a pastor that's a singular or alone, you'll find that the congregation will start peeling back because they don't want to be associated. Not because they don't believe the same stuff, it's that they just want to be attacked.
Yeah.
And so part of it's it's not just the pastor, it's will a community come together and say, regardless of what this man says, this is actually what I believe my Bible says. Yeah. And then, so it's it's not just from a leadership standpoint, it's all of us together. Will we come together on some of these issues, especially when it's against sin and trying to promote life in the world? Will we
Yeah.
come together, or will we disband because of fear of the world?
And you're calling for, I think, what I think is much needed in the church, and that's unity, right? We read in John Jesus' prayer for unity amongst the church, and it would be our proof that Jesus exists, right? And I think what's difficult about that is, in many regards, there seems to be a lack of unity on some of these front door issues, right? And even the secondary ones. But even I think less than that. I think the front door issues, there seems to be a lot of disunity within the church, and there is disagreement on it, which I think only makes your suggestion even more difficult of a task, right?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily disagree with you. I actually think that it is helpful for there to be unity amongst the church and for us to understand, because no matter what, you're going to have far conservative, right-wing, to use political terms,
Sure.
right? But a lot of fundamental type of thinking in this issue and in this matter. And to the far left, liberal, and I think that's political as well as within the church, liberal way of thinking and interpretation, that would still consider themselves within the body of Christ, but steps away from what's considered been orthodox in many of these areas, right? And where do we find the middle ground, and where do we find unity with this, right? And at the end of the day, I think it comes back to the Word. But then, of course, then we're running into interpretive issues, right? And what lens are we using for our hermeneutic, right? And how is it that we're deciding upon this passage is interpreted? But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Andrew, what do you think? What advice would you give a pastor or a church to say, how do we think differently about First Amendment rights and issues?
Yeah, I think just going off of Sam here, I think what really is one of the biggest things is that, like he was saying, we need to start preaching the truth, and I think they need to be prepared for the repercussion of preaching the truth in a society that doesn't like hearing it, like it's always been. But also to keep going strong, to keep preaching it, because I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I would give them is that from a person of this generation, this era, especially if you're in the middle-aged area, we are growing up in a society that is rejecting rationalism. Now we have reached a breaking point with rationalism, that we've developed our own postmodern therapeutic moralistic deism. And what it's happening is that we've realized as young Christians and young people across the world that there is so much more to us than matter and cells being held together by fictional glue and space dust, and so from a cosmic accident. And our souls, I think we're starting to realize that they're there and they're crying out. And you have such a large cry, and you see that in this new age spiritualistic society that's happening in the Western world, with teenagers becoming very popular, just believe there's a God out there, or there's a God or this God and blah, 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 of the moon, of the garden. And so what you're starting to see is just this, basically this modern day Hinduism that's been rebranded and revamped for a Western society. And I think it's just to preach towards the spirit, preach towards the spiritual side. We also need that, not to say just to hone in on it, but the people, I think we've forgotten, especially living in a rational society, the incredible that's in the Bible, and that we are crying out. And as C.S. Lewis teaches us, never have we met a mere mortal. Our souls are eternal, whether destined for heaven or damned to hell.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think just to keep that in mind and to preach to it. And people are crying out, they need spiritual sustenance. And I think the church can really be that, and I think that the pastor can be that.
Yeah.
And so I would just really recommend and just really advise just to really dive into that.
Yeah, yeah. Paul, what do you think? What would you advise a pastor or a church leader to how to engage with these issues of First Amendment rights and freedom of religion?
Yeah, I really like what you guys said. I think that's right on the money, that we have to keep preaching the gospel no matter what happens. I would encourage them to stay politically active where they can. I think that freedom in the United States has done really great things for the church. I mean, the United States has sent out more missionaries in 2010 than pretty much all the other countries. So I think that there are good things. We do get comfortable. That happens. But I think that there are also some really passionate Christians that come out of that too. So I'd encourage them to stay active in the political sphere. I love that about the United States and about Christianity too. There's this encouragement for dialogue, for interaction and stuff. Like Jesus, when he was bringing disciples, he said, count the cost. You know, he's not just saying, blindly follow me, but actually think about this. Think about the commitment that I'm asking you to make and see if you can do it. And so, yeah, I mean, if I was a pastor, that's what I would do. I would keep fighting for that, but still be prepared to face the consequences if it doesn't go our way. And always, always keep preaching the gospel.
And I would even add to that, in doing all that, having friends, making sure you have friends to do something like that. Like Daniel wasn't alone. You know, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
He wasn't alone in that.
Yeah.
Even Moses, when he was going, he had Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. You know, he had those people that they were close to.
Yeah.
And I think that's key to it, that we know that we're not in it alone. Yes, we have Jesus with us at all times, but knowing that we have brothers and sisters here, I think really helps encourage that fight.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, what's interesting is you guys talking about preaching the gospel, right? And I think the heart of the gospel there is salvation by faith alone, by grace alone, in Christ alone, right? And I think when we start to preach that message and that sermon and we hit it home, it kind of transcends the front of the issues. It begins to dissect the heart and the mind, and it begins to you know, penetrate to those deep areas all the way down to the marrow, right, of the bone. And the gospel sets us free from sinful pleasures, sinful states, and it begins to convict, right, where it needs to convict, and yet bring great love and grace to us in ways that we didn't even expect it to, right? And that's only done by the power of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one who brings that about into the person, right? Who then can receive that and respond to that. And so I agree with you. I think that we do need to be gospel preachers and remind ourselves as to what the core of the gospel is. And yes, there's a message of repentance, but there's also a message of great grace and a hope. Right. And understanding that we need to have a great understanding of the depth of sin and how it has corrupted, not just our morals, right? But yet it has corrupted the creation. The creation has fallen to such a degree that, I mean, you know, when Adam and Eve left the garden, you know, they were able to hang out with the lions. Now the lion's looking for Adam and Eve for lunch, right? There's a depthness to sin, and Christ is coming to restore those things, and has come to restore them, and will do an ultimate restoration and fulfillment of his great promise of reconciling the world back to himself again in the second coming. And I think that we need to be ready for that. And I think we need to continue to be preaching this message of hope and this message of salvation that comes through Christ alone. And it's not always going to be easy, and we will run into those issues. And I think we're walking in muddy waters today. I think that we are, and this is why this conversation came about, and this is why it's been on the heart of our students to have this discussion and to talk about it. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you for just sharing so bravely and boldly as well on this topic and on this issue. I'm grateful for you guys, and I feel like I've learned a lot even from you guys tonight, so thank you guys. So just to kind of wrap up, thanks again for joining us for Expression, a discussion on religious freedom presented by the Moody Media Lab. You can learn more about us by visiting us online at moodymedialab.com. Thanks for joining us.